Eleanor had always believed that love was best expressed in the quiet things, the handwritten letters, the perfectly folded scarves, the way she saved her daughter's childhood drawings in a cedar box for decades. Now 78, a widow for 12 years, and a retired librarian who still alphabetized her spice rack, Eleanor lived alone in the modest two-story colonial she had once shared with Harold, the only man she'd ever loved. Since his passing, the house felt quieter, but never empty, each corner still holding whispers of shared memories, each window catching the light the way he used to smile at her in the mornings. Tell us what you think, and feel free to share your own story with us in the comments. Her daughter, Vanessa, was turning 50, a milestone. And although their weekly phone calls had grown shorter and more polite over the years, Eleanor held tight to the belief that deep down, the bond between mother and daughter still pulsed, however faintly. So she decided to surprise her. For 2 full days, Eleanor poured her love into a carrot cake 3 layers high, frosted with cream cheese and crowned with 24 hand-shaped marzipan carrots. Her fingers ached from rolling and pinching the delicate orange and green shapes, but the pain was nothing compared to the joy she imagined on Vanessa's face. She packed the cake carefully into a container, nestled it between 2 pillows in the passenger seat of her car. Before dawn, she wrapped herself in Harold's old cardigan, filled a thermos with French roast, and set off through a growing storm. The weather forecast had warned of heavy rain across state lines, but she brushed it off with a smile and a whispered, "It's just a little water." The drive stretched long 9 hours of slick roads, foggy windows, and aching knees. The arthritis had gotten worse in recent years, but she kept going, imagining Vanessa's surprise, her arms flung open, her voice bubbling with joy. "Mom, you came?" That vision carried Eleanor forward through every puddle, every honking truck that sprayed her windshield with walls of muddy rain. Each mile was an act of love. Each turn on the road a quiet declaration, "You matter enough for this." By the time she reached Vanessa's neighborhood, Eleanor was soaked, exhausted, and trembling from cold. But her heart was warm with hope. She didn't need applause, or even a thank you, just a look-on look from her daughter that said, "You still have a place in my life." As she stepped out into the storm, cradling the cake like a fragile treasure, Eleanor truly believed that love, even when unannounced, would always be enough to open the door. By the time Eleanor reached Vanessa's street, the storm had settled into a steady downpour, drumming gently against the roof of her car. The sky was a deep, silvery gray, and her windshield wipers moved rhythmically, like a quiet metronome marking the pace of her heartbeat. Her knees ached, her back throbbed. But none of that mattered. She was here. She had made it. She parked across the street from Vanessa's house, careful not to pull into the driveway. She wanted the surprise to be perfect. The windows glowed warmly from the inside, casting golden light out onto the rain-slicked pavement. Eleanor smiled through the fatigue and tightened her grip around the cake carrier. She'd envisioned this moment for days. The door was unlocked, just as it always was when guests were expected. With slow, careful steps, she entered, dripping water onto the pristine marble tiles of the entryway. The scent of rosemary and garlic drifted through the air, mingling with laughter from the kitchen. Her heart lifted until she heard her name. "God, I hope she crashes," Vanessa's voice rang out, light with mockery, but sharp enough to cut. Eleanor froze, her breath caught somewhere between her chest and her throat. Brian, her son-in-law, chuckled in response. "Or at least disappear for the weekend. I just want a break from the guilt trips." Their laughter followed, casual and cruel. Eleanor stood motionless in the hallway, the cake trembling slightly in her hands. The warmth she had felt moments earlier vanished, replaced by a cold that had nothing to do with the weather. She hadn't been seen, hadn't been heard, and in that moment, she realized she hadn't truly been considered either. She imagined Vanessa and Brian standing side by side in the kitchen. Maybe she was chopping vegetables, maybe he was stirring a pot on the stove. Just another ordinary evening for them. Ordinary enough to joke about wishing harm upon the woman who had raised Vanessa with bedtime stories, hand-sewn costumes, and letters slipped into lunchboxes. The pain wasn't loud. It didn't scream or rage. It was quiet, sharp, precise, like a pin slipping into the heart. Not enough to cause a scene, but enough to shatter something that would never fit back together the same way again. Eleanor didn't say a word. She didn't announce herself or ask for an explanation. Instead, she walked silently into the kitchen. Vanessa and Brian turned, their smiles fading as their eyes met hers. Shock swept across their faces like a wave, but she said nothing. Not a syllable. With trembling grace, she placed the cake on the counter, 3 layers of hope and history, now quietly dismissed, and turned away. "Mom," Vanessa began, her voice suddenly desperate. But Eleanor was already walking, her shoes leaving damp prints on their flawless floors. She stepped out into the rain without an umbrella, letting the storm soak through her coat and hair. The wind bit at her face, the cold crept into her bones. But she didn't look back. As she opened the car door, she saw her reflection faintly in the driver's side window. A woman weathered by life, but still standing. A mother whose love had traveled 9 hours through thunder and aching joints only to find she had long been written out of the story. She sat in silence for a moment, her hands gripping the wheel, her heart wrapped in silence. Outside, the storm kept falling. Inside, something even heavier had begun to settle. The realization that sometimes the deepest betrayals don't come from enemies, but from those you love the most. And without anger, without tears, Eleanor drove away, not from her daughter's house, but from the illusion that love alone was enough to be welcomed. The drive back from Vanessa's house was a blur. The rain, the ache, the heartbreak, it all melted into a kind of numbness Eleanor hadn't known before. She didn't cry. Not that night. Instead, she sat in a modest motel room off the interstate, her coat still damp, the silence pressing in on her like a weighted blanket. The cake, once a symbol of love, was gone. But what stung more was the growing suspicion that the cruelty she overheard wasn't an isolated momentee, was a window into a larger, painful truth. In the stillness of that motel room, Eleanor began to piece together a puzzle she hadn't realized she'd been solving for years. She remembered the time Vanessa and Brian couldn't afford new furniture after the baby, and how Eleanor had co-signed for a credit card to help them. Then came the second card, for unexpected medical bills, the loan for the home office renovation, the refinancing of their mortgage. Just a formality, Mom, but your name will help get us better terms. Each decision had been framed as a gesture of love, a mother's support, a family helping each other. But now, that framing cracked wide open, revealing a different picture beneath of silent exploitation. Eleanor opened her small leather notebook, the one she used for grocery lists and birthdays, and began to jot down each financial decision she'd made for Vanessa over the years. The numbers added up quickly, but what struck her more than the money was the pattern. Every request for help had followed a season of emotional distance. Each check or signature had been a substitute for presence, a stand-in for affection. She thought about last Christmas, when Vanessa said they couldn't fly home because money was tight. The same week, Vanessa posted photos from a luxury ski resort in Aspen. "A gift from Brian's company," she had said casually when Eleanor had gently asked about it. It was then that the fog began to lift. The truth was no longer blurry. Vanessa and Brian had not just drifted from her emotionally, they had rerouted their connection to her through transactions. And Eleanor, in the name of love, had allowed it. She wasn't angry yet. That would come later. What she felt now was something quieter, but more powerful. Clarity. The realization that her worth had been measured in credit scores and bank signatures, not presence or wisdom. That she had been useful, not cherished. And worst of all, it had all been cloaked in the language of family, so she wouldn't see it until it was far too late. Eleanor didn't scream. She didn't call Vanessa or demand an apology. No dramatic confrontation unfolded over the phone or in tearful letters. Instead, she did something far more powerful. She chose silence with purpose and action with precision. In the days that followed her quiet departure from her daughter's home, Eleanor made a series of appointments. The first was with her longtime estate attorney, Margaret Lowell, a woman with silver-streaked hair and a reputation for discretion. They met in a modest office overlooking a park, where sunlight streamed through tall windows and papers shuffled like whispers. "I'd like to make some changes," Eleanor said calmly, placing a folder on the desk. Margaret studied her face for a moment. "To your will?" "Yes," Eleanor replied, "and to everything else." They worked for hours. The house that Eleanor had lovingly maintained after her husband's passing, the colonial with ivy on the walls and the maple tree out front, was no longer earmarked for Vanessa. Nor were the stock holdings, pension accounts, or the modest but meaningful art collection she and her late husband had curated over decades. Instead, Eleanor redirected her legacy toward the Millwood Women's Resource Center shelter and support organization she had once volunteered for, a place where dignity was restored, not taken for granted. It would go to women rebuilding their lives from betrayal and loss, women who knew what it felt like to be overlooked, unheard, or used. "I want this money to mean something," Eleanor said as she signed the final document. "Not to enable comfort, but to empower courage." Margaret nodded, her expression softening. "You're not doing this out of spite." "No," Eleanor agreed. "I'm doing it out of love, not the kind my daughter expects anymore." After that, she made additional calls, methodical, measured. She contacted banks and financial institutions, slowly disentangling herself from every guarantee, every shared responsibility. One by one, her name disappeared from credit lines, mortgage documents, and loan applications. No announcements, no fanfare. Just the slow, deliberate undoing of a role she had never truly agreed to play. At night, she felt lighter, not from vengeance, but from the quiet reclaiming of her self-worth. She no longer waited for calls that never came, or longed for affection that had turned conditional. Her power had never been in confrontation. It lay in the ability to walk away, and this time, to take her name, her voice, and her value with her. What she left behind wasn't punishment. It was permission for herself to begin again, free of obligation, and full of clarity. It didn't take long for the consequences to arrive. Not in waves, but in ruthless, unmistakable blows, each more jarring than the last. Vanessa and Brian, who once lived with the polished ease of people accustomed to everything falling into place, were suddenly stumbling through a series of financial implosions. The first call came from their bank. Their platinum credit card used for catered dinners, designer clothes, and impulsive weekend getaways was declined at a restaurant. Brian thought it was a glitch. Vanessa laughed it off in front of their friends. But the next day, it happened again. Then again. Soon their remaining cards followed suit, each one frozen like a verdict. They called the bank in confusion and indignation, only to be told the same thing over and over. The guarantor had been removed. The credit limit no longer applied. Risk had recalibrated without Eleanor's quiet backing, and reality was closing in fast. 2 days later, the mortgage company called. The final review of their pre-approval for the beach house in Cape Haven had revealed inconsistencies. Without Eleanor's secondary guarantee, the loan was too risky. The deal collapsed. The property they had dreamt of, spoken about at brunches, posted in cryptic Instagram hints, was off the table. It was like watching a sandcastle collapse under a sudden wave. Only this time, the wave had a name: Eleanor. They didn't understand at first. How could she? Why would she? They left voicemails with increasingly frantic tones. Vanessa's were laced with worry. "Mom, I'm really scared. Please call me." Brian's messages were more clipped, dressed in civility, but steeped in blame. "We need to talk. This has gone too far." When their calls went unanswered, they resorted to long paragraphs of half apologies and full accusations. "We were just stressed," Vanessa wrote. "You took it the wrong way." Brian's message was more direct. "You're sabotaging our future over a misunderstanding." Then came the letters, handwritten on expensive stationery, filled with forced sentiment and vague attempts at manipulation. "We love you," one read, "but your silence is hurting us." None of them mentioned what Eleanor had overheard in that kitchen. None of them acknowledged the betrayal, the wish that she would crash, disappear, die. Instead, they clung to an illusion they had carefully maintained for years, that Eleanor was a resource, not a person. That love was something they could withdraw, like a bank deposit, whenever it suited them. That guilt was a leash and affection, a currency. But Eleanor had cut the leash, and now they were spinning. Bills mounted, payments were missed. The pristine lifestyle that had once seemed so effortlessly curated began to fray. Brian took on a consulting job he once would have scoffed Atlas for the money than for the health benefits. Vanessa canceled her yoga retreat and tried to reschedule therapy sessions around part-time real estate classes. She didn't tell her friends. She told herself it was temporary. But the desperation seeped through. They reached out to mutual acquaintances. "Have you heard from Eleanor? Is she okay?" "She's not answering. We're worried." But their concern was calculated, transparent. Even those closest to them began to notice the cracks. Friends who had once admired their polished exterior now whispered about the tension in their voices, the strain behind the smiles. Eleanor, meanwhile, watched in silence, not with vindictiveness, but with clarity. She didn't respond to the messages. She didn't return the calls. Not because she didn't hear them, but because, for the first time in decades, she understood that hearing didn't require replying. She owed them no explanation, no comfort, no defense. Her decision had not been rooted in revenge. It was liberation. She sat on her porch with a cup of tea, letting the wind brush her cheeks. Around her, her garden bloomed vivid and unapologetic. Her phone remained silent. Her boundaries held strong. Let them feel it. Let them sit with the weight of what they had said. Let them finally recognize that you cannot build a life on someone else's silence and expect it to stand. Because one day, silence turns into action. And the storm you joked about becomes the reckoning you never saw coming. For the first time in decades, Eleanor began to breathe in a rhythm that belonged entirely to her. There were no guilt trips to plan, no awkward phone calls filled with forced laughter and clipped goodbyes. There were no one-sided holidays, no anxious waits for visits that never came. In the quiet that followed the storm, Eleanor discovered something unexpected, not emptiness, but space. Space to rediscover the woman she had once been before she became a provider, a guarantor, an invisible presence orbiting someone else's life. She began to paint again, not professionally, not for praise, but for the joy of watching colors blend and form something new. Her fingers, stiffened by time, moved across watercolor paper with a kind of tenderness she had long forgotten. The blues and greens she mixed reminded her of the sea Harold once promised they'd retire near. She painted it now, not to mourn a life that never happened, but to honor the dreamer she used to be. In her kitchen, Eleanor returned to cooking not for others, not out of obligation, but as an act of self-care. She tried new recipes, spicy lentil stews, lemon tarts with imperfect crusts, roasted vegetables tossed with herbs from her garden. Meals became moments, not chores. She plated them beautifully, even if she dined alone. She was no longer waiting for a guest to justify beauty. At the community center, Eleanor joined a watercolor class and a senior walking group that explored local trails each Thursday morning. She was slower than most, but her presence never felt like a burden. The other women welcomed her with warm smiles and open arms. They spoke not of their children's achievements, but of their own dreams, setbacks, and small victories. Most transformative of all was her time at the women's shelter. Twice a week, Eleanor sat with women decades younger, some bruised by life, others just beginning again. She helped with resumes, practiced mock interviews, sometimes just listened. And in their stories, raw and unfiltered, she saw echoes of her own. Different paths, but familiar pain. The quiet erosion of self-worth, the yearning to be seen. But unlike before, Eleanor was no longer invisible. In this new world she'd built, she was valued not for what she gave away, but for who she was. Her circle widened. There was Theta, her spirited neighbor, now her constant companion in late-night tea and early morning gardening. There was Harriet, her sharp-tongued attorney turned confidant. And there were the women at the shelter, who hugged her tightly each time she walked through the door. Eleanor had lost a version of family, but she had gained something deeper. A life lived on her own terms, surrounded by people who didn't expect her to shrink, sacrifice, or stay silent. She had not merely moved on. She had moved forward with peace, with dignity, and finally, with joy. The call came on a crisp autumn morning as Eleanor was watering the rosemary by her kitchen window. The number was unfamiliar, and for a moment, she considered letting it ring. But something, perhaps intuition, perhaps habit, nudged her to answer. "Is this Mrs. Eleanor Bennett?" a calm voice asked. "This is Dr. Leland from Hartford Memorial. Your daughter Vanessa is here. She's stable, but there were complications with her pregnancy. She asked us to call you." Eleanor's hand trembled slightly around the handle of the watering can. "Is she all right?" "She is. But she's scared. She asked for you specifically. She said to tell you she's sorry if you meant what you wrote in your card." 3 hours later, Eleanor stepped into the quiet, sterile corridor of the hospital's maternity wing. The same woman who had once wished her away was now waiting for her, not with pride, not with entitlement, but with teary eyes and hands curled protectively over a growing life. Vanessa looked smaller somehow, not just physically but emotionally, like someone who had finally peeled back the armor she'd worn for too long. When she saw her mother, the tears began before words could form. "You came," she whispered. "You asked," Eleanor replied, taking the seat beside her bed. There was silence at first, thick with the weight of everything unspoken. Machines beeped softly in the background. Finally, Vanessa began. "I've been seeing a therapist," she said, since the beach house fell through. At first it was about the stress, but it became more than that. She started asking questions I never wanted to answer. About why I pushed you away. Why I saw your love as something suffocating instead of sustaining." Eleanor listened without interruption, her hands folded gently in her lap. "I was angry," Vanessa admitted. "At life. At myself. At you for being the one person who always stayed. And I turned that anger into distance, sarcasm, cruelty. I confused your concern for control, and I let Brian," her voice cracked, "I let him twist the narrative because it was easier to follow than to face the truth." Eleanor's eyes glistened, but she didn't cry. "Not this time. I don't expect things to go back to the way they were," Vanessa said. "But I want to try to build something new, honest, real. Before this child comes into the world, I need to know I didn't lose everything that ever mattered." Eleanor reached for her daughter's hand, their fingers folding together like they used to when fear visited in childhood nights. "Trying," Eleanor said softly, "is a good place to begin." And in that small hospital room, without fanfare or guarantees, a seed of reconciliation was planted, not as payment, but as hope. Eleanor didn't rush into forgiveness. She didn't declare everything was suddenly fine just because her daughter had cried in a hospital bed. Time had taught her that real healing was a journey, not a moment. So she opened her heart, but not without boundaries. "I'm willing to rebuild," she told Vanessa, "but not if it means erasing what happened. Not if it means I go back to being someone you only remember when you need something." Vanessa nodded, eyes rimmed red. "I understand. I don't want that either." "There will be conditions," Eleanor continued gently but firmly. "No more secrets. No more financial entanglements. No more pretending. If you want a relationship with me, it must be built on mutual respect, honesty, and care, not obligation." It was not a threat, it was clarity, a quiet declaration of worth from a woman who had spent too many years waiting for someone else to define it. Vanessa listened. She didn't argue. Maybe, just maybe, she was beginning to understand. The months that followed weren't perfect. There were awkward conversations, moments of discomfort, and setbacks. But there were also cups of tea shared in silence, letters exchanged with honesty, and most precious of a la grandmother preparing for the arrival of a grandchild with cautious hope. Eleanor continued her life, painting, gardening, volunteering, laughing with friends. But now, her heart had a door slightly ajar, waiting for those willing to enter with truth and humility. This was not a story about revenge. It was a story about remembering one's value, about a woman who dared to stop giving from a place of pain and started living from a place of peace. The ending wasn't cinematic, but it was real. And sometimes, reality is more powerful than perfect. because love without respect isn't love at all. And dignity? It's not a prize to be earned, it's the ground we must all stand on.